They say the magnolia trees grew too fast that spring, their blossoms too white, their scent too sweet, as if the air itself were trying to cover the rot beneath it. And though no one spoke it aloud, everyone in the quarters knew something had been fed to the roots that was never meant to sleep. The midwife's cabin sat just beyond the edge of the plantation road, where the cypress shadows thickened and the frogs stopped croaking after midnight, the kind of silence that presses on the skull like prayer gone wrong. And in that silence she worked, hands steady, voice low, eyes turned to the soil as if listening for orders that came from underneath. Old women said she was born with the veil, a scrap of membrane over her eyes. Torn away at birth but never forgotten, they said such children could see the spirits that walked before dawn, could hear the breath of the unborn, could tell when a soul chose not to come through, and could make peace with the ones who refused. No one ever saw her smile, but they saw her in the fields at dusk, bent among the magnolia roots, whispering names that didn't belong to any living child, digging just enough to hide something small, something wrapped in linen too clean for a slave. And when she rose again, her lips were moving like someone reciting a list they had been forced to memorize. They tried to ask her once what she was burying, but her eyes went black in the firelight, her voice rasping like a door hinge. "Ain't mine to tell, only mine to cover." And after that, even the overseer stopped asking questions, because the land itself had begun to change. The magnolia petals fell thick as snow that season, blanketing the graves of children and beasts alike, and every morning the air smelled faintly of milk and iron, a sweetness laced with blood, a perfume that made even the mistress weep without knowing why some nights. The field hands swore they could hear a baby crying from beneath the trees, faint, rhythmic, like a wind through hollow reeds. And one man, Caleb, took a lantern to find the sound, walking barefoot between the blossoms, calling softly, "Hush now, whoever you are," until the crying stopped, and when he looked down, the light showed tiny handprints pressed into the mud between his feet. The next morning, his hair was white as frost and he couldn't remember his own name. The master said it was fever, but the slaves whispered otherwise, said the child had called him by name, said he had looked into the ground and seen eyes looking back, said he'd heard them say, "You came too early," before the soil closed again. The midwife didn't deny it. She only warned, "The ones you bury too deep, don't forget who laid them there," and went on tending to births that never ended in cries, only in silence and the turning of earth by midsummer. The roots of the magnolias had cracked the old fence posts, thick and gnarled as the fingers of the dead, their blossoms pale as bones, their shadows long enough to reach the cabins at dusk, and every night the midwife could be seen kneeling, her apron stained, her hands coated in red clay, murmuring into the soil as if comforting something restless below. Once, the mistress sent for her to help deliver another white child, the third that month, and though the mother's body gave way easily, the air in the room turned cold, the lamp sputtered, and the baby came out silent, no cry, no breath, only a faint warmth, as if its soul had left before its body had finished. The midwife laid it down without flinching, her eyes flicking toward the window where the magnolias swayed, though there was no wind, and whispered, "It's waiting. Missus, the ground's hungry tonight." The mistress slapped her, but the woman didn't react, only turned her face toward the soil beyond the pane, and smiled the smallest, saddest smile. Later that night, the field hand saw her walking toward the trees with the white bundle in her arms, moonlight slick on her skin, her shadow moving strange and slow, as if something beneath the earth was pulling her forward, step by step, until she vanished among the magnolias by dawn. The blossoms had turned a deeper shade, pink at first, then almost crimson, and when the mistress awoke, she found her own infant's cradle filled with petals, damp and trembling, as if freshly cut from a living thing. They say if you stand beneath those trees before sunrise, you can hear the heartbeat of something buried but unbroken, and if you listen too long, you'll start to feel it beneath your own ribs, answering you in rhythm, beating back, wanting out. That was the spring the magnolias bloomed forever, and none of them, not the mistress, not the field hands, not even the midwife herself, remembered what had been planted there first, only that it still moved, and it still cried. If you still want to hear the rest of the story, hit the subscribe button and don't forget to press that bell icon. There were nights when the house itself seemed to inhale, slow and deep, as if trying to remember the scent of what it once held, the sweet musk of milk, the rot of afterbirth, the warmth of something alive that should not have died. The plantation house stood on a rise above the quarters, white paint flaking like old skin, its columns crooked, its windows forever half-shuttered against the heat. But no one ever mistook that stillness for peace, because the walls sighed when the wind stopped, and the floorboards pulsed under bare feet like veins under flesh. The mistress, pale and sleepless, kept her candle burning through every hour of darkness, whispering to the empty cradle beside her bed, "You're safe here, little one," though she knew the cradle had been empty for months. Sometimes she woke to hear the soft patter of feet across the upstairs hall, small, light, uneven, and once when she opened the door, the rocking chair in the corner was moving by itself, slow as a heartbeat, creaking to a rhythm that made her throat close. The midwife had been gone for weeks now, banished after that last birth ended in silence, yet the smell of iron and lavender still hung in the birthing room, and the stains on the floorboards darkened instead of fading, as though the house were keeping its own memory of what she'd done at first. The servants said it was the rats making the noises, scratching, running, whispering, but there were no rats, no nests, only the faint sound of a baby sighing when the air grew too still by the third week. The mistress no longer entered that room, but the house did not seem to need her permission. For at night the door would swing open on its own, and warm light would flicker inside, though no lamp was lit. "Midwife?" she whispered once, standing in the doorway, her candle trembling, but the only reply was a wet shuffling sound, like linen dragging across wood, and when she stepped forward, she saw the cradle move just once, back and forth, and then stop. She backed away, pressing her hand to her stomach, where an ache had started to bloom, deep and low, as if remembering pain she had never felt downstairs. The portraits of her ancestors had begun to fade, their painted eyes turning to smudges, the color leaching out of the canvas, and in their place, faint outlines of tiny hands appeared, pressed against the varnish from the inside. The cook refused to come into the house after dark, said she heard crying under the floorboards, said it wasn't a child's voice but a woman's, low, tired, whispering a name over and over, "Mercy, Mercy." The mistress told her to hush, that it was just the wind. But when she walked back through the hall, she heard the same voice behind her, closer now, breath brushing the back of her neck. "Mercy won't come here." She turned, and there was no one, only the long hallway breathing, the wallpaper rippling as though air moved behind it, the faint milk-sour smell returning stronger than before on the fourth night. The house began to hum. It was not a sound exactly, more like a vibration through the wood, a rhythm that matched the pulse in her wrists, and with it came the unmistakable sound of water boiling somewhere, though the kitchen fires were cold. She followed the noise to the birthing room and found a basin on the floor, full to the brim though no one had filled it, the water inside trembling as though something beneath it were breathing. When she leaned close, a ripple spread across the surface, and she saw not her own reflection, but the face of the midwife, eyes open, mouth stitched shut, nodding once before sinking into darkness. The mistress screamed and the basin shattered, flooding the floor with a smell like soil after rain by morning. The servants were gone. Only the midwife's old shawl remained on the stair rail, damp and heavy, leaving a trail of reddish water down the steps. The mistress locked herself in the master bedroom and waited for sunrise. But the light never came. The sky stayed the color of spoiled cream, and the magnolias outside leaned toward the windows as though listening. She began to feel the house breathing again, this time slower, more deliberate, and each breath seemed to pull the air from her lungs, drawing her closer to the birthing room. By midnight, she could no longer resist. Her feet moved of their own accord down the hallway, candlelight shaking in her hands, the house groaning with pleasure, as if welcoming her back when she reached the door. It was already open inside. The cradle rocked itself once more, but now there was weight inside, a small bundle wrapped in linen, still silent, waiting. The mistress stepped closer, whispering, "My child." The bundle moved, and from beneath the linen came the unmistakable sound of soil shifting, slow, wet, patient, as if something beneath the house were answering her call. She leaned in, trembling, her fingers brushing the cloth, and the cradle began to rock faster, the walls breathing harder, the candle bending toward the cradle as though pulled by a heartbeat deep in the wood. When she pulled back the linen, the candle went out in the darkness. The only thing left was the sound, a faint, steady rhythm, small breaths rising from below the floorboards, and a whisper that was not hers saying, "You're safe here, little one. You're home now." Then the cradle stopped, and the house exhaled. They said her hands were steady, because they were not hers anymore, that whatever guided them no longer belonged to the flesh. And when she worked, the air itself leaned close, listening to the rhythm of her breath, the way the thunder held still when she began to pray. She moved like one half dreaming, her face glistening with sweat and candlelight, her lips repeating words no one else knew, words that smelled like iron and dust. Like the corners of a church that had forgotten God, the mothers trusted her, because they had no choice, and because every child she delivered came out silent, smooth, untouched by the screaming that usually followed birth, as if her hands coaxed life without pain, or perhaps without permission. When the storms rolled through the fields, she did not flinch, even as lightning tore the sky apart and rain bled through the roof. Dripping into the basin at her feet, she never stopped, her hands working slow and certain, her voice murmuring low, "Hush now. Little one, don't fight what's coming." One night, the mistress stood in the doorway and watched her work, the smell of sweat and storm mixing with lavender and milk, and though the midwife's eyes were open, she did not blink. She did not even breathe. She simply moved, each gesture exact, each cut of the cord precise as ritual. When the child came, blue and still, the mistress gasped, but the midwife only smiled, her teeth shining like wet ivory. "Ain't dead yet," she whispered, and dipped her fingers into the basin. The thunder outside stopped altogether. She placed her wet fingers over the infant's mouth, and when she drew them away, the child took one breath, soft and shallow, and began to hum, not cry, not wail, hum, a trembling note that matched the pulse beneath the floorboards. The mistress backed away, crossing herself. "What are you doing?" she whispered, but the midwife didn't answer, only turned toward her, her pupils wide, black as the soil under the magnolias, and said softly, "Every soul comes owing something." When morning came, the child was gone. The mother swore she'd heard footsteps in the night, bare and slow, leading out through the fields toward the magnolia grove. And though the earth was dry, there were prints left behind, small, deep, wet with something darker than rain. By the next week, the midwife's hands began to change. The skin around her wrists darkened, veins rising like ropes, her palms stiffening, the nails thick and black at the edges, but still, they never shook, not even when she held a blade, not even when she caught sight of what she'd become in the mirror above the washstand once. The preacher came to see her, said the Lord demanded she stop her work, that she was meddling with what was not hers, and she smiled without warmth, then tell him to send someone else to do it, and went back to boiling linen that night. The preacher's wife went into labor, weeks too early, and though he swore he'd find another to deliver, the cries came too fast, and the only person who answered his call was her. When she arrived, the house trembled, the windows fogged though no rain fell, and the preacher felt the air grow heavy, thick with something unholy. She worked in silence that night, her hands slick and sure, her face blank, and when the baby came, its first breath came out as steam, curling into the shape of a hand before vanishing. The preacher tried to bless it, but his tongue swelled in his mouth, the words choking before they left his throat. The midwife only whispered, "Don't name it yet. Names make them remember." By dawn, she was gone again, leaving behind a small print on the cradle's sheet, as if a second set of hands had rested there beside hers. From that day forward, she wore gloves, thin linen ones, even in the heat. And though the mothers trusted her still, some began to notice that the babies she touched too long grew quiet, that her fingers left marks that didn't fade, shaped like bruises or blessings. No one could tell which. When she washed in the river, the water around her turned dark and slow, and fish surfaced belly up, as if listening. Old Isaac, the gravedigger, said he saw her once by moonlight, her gloves off, her hands buried wrist-deep in the soil, whispering to something that whispered back. And when he called her name, she turned and said, "It's never the living that keep me company, Isaac." By the next morning, Isaac's shovel was found split in half beside a fresh mound, and no one ever asked who was inside as the months passed. The births grew more frequent and stranger, babies born with eyes open, babies that never cried, babies whose fingers curled around invisible threads, as if pulling on something only they could see. The women began to fear her, yet they still sent for her, because every time she came, The pain stopped, the air stilled, and no one, not even God, had dared to interrupt her work. They said her hands moved with a rhythm older than prayer, that she had once dipped them in the blood of something that promised never to let them falter again. And on the last night anyone saw her, she walked barefoot into the magnolia grove, her gloves gone, her hands glowing faintly in the dark, pulsing like hearts outside of bodies. The trees bent toward her as she passed, petals falling in silent flurries, and the ground trembled under each step in the distance. Thunder rolled, not from the sky but from below. The sound of something vast and buried turning over in its sleep. She stopped at the edge of the graves and whispered, "I kept them steady. Now it's your turn." The wind died, the trees stilled, and when the next flash of lightning came, there were dozens of hands reaching up from the soil, pale and slick, grasping for hers, and still she did not shake. The first time they saw one, it was drifting in the shallows, pale as wax, silent as glass, its eyelids trembling like a moth's wings beneath the moon, and by morning, the water around it had turned the color of spoiled milk. Cypress Hollow was not the kind of place a man rode through twice. It lay behind the swamps, past the drowned fence posts and the moss-hung trees that leaned too low, as if listening for something beneath the soil. The wind there moved without direction, and the ground never stopped breathing. Every dawn a new mist rose, thick, warm, then smelling faintly of birth. They said the midwife had once lived at the edge of the hollow, a woman neither young nor old, her eyes too still, her hands too quiet. She came whenever the plantations called for her, and the mothers said she brought peace to their pain. But peace in those lands always came with a price. When the moon swelled full, she was seen walking toward the water, barefoot, white cloth over her head. In her arms always something wrapped tight, and those who dared follow her swore the bundle twitched. They heard her humming a low, wordless tune, the same one she hummed in the birthing rooms. Right before the cries stopped, the hollow kept its secrets. It had since the wars, since the burning fields, since the bones of the forgotten were ploughed under the cypress roots, and now the land itself seemed to answer her. The frogs fell silent when she passed, the owls turned their heads away, and the water shivered, as though it recognized its own reflection in her. One night, a field hand named Ellis followed her through the fog. He was young and foolish, his heart still full of the world's light. He said he only wanted to know what she buried, or who. The others told him to let the hollow keep what it owned. But he laughed, and when he didn't return, they said the hollow had claimed another by morning, where they found his lantern half submerged near the cypress roots, and next to it, small footprints pressed in the mud. Too small to be his, too many to belong to one child. Each step leading not away from the water but out of it. The midwife did not appear that day nor the next, but the hollow began to whisper, in the reeds, in the walls of the houses, in the throats of sleeping mothers. They said they could hear the faintest sounds, tiny hands patting against the floorboards, the soft cooing of something newborn, but not living, the smell of wet linen, of milk gone sour at night. The women woke to find their cradles swaying on their own, and sometimes inside a shape they didn't recognize, a child pale as a candle stub, its eyes open but unblinking, and when they looked too long it smiled, slow and wrong. The mistress of the Hollingsworth estate swore she heard crying in the walls. She tore through the plaster with her bare hands, until she found nothing but damp wood and tiny teeth embedded in the grain. After that, no one dared speak the midwife's name aloud. They just called her the one who knew when the soil wanted something back. One night, thunder rolled low over the hollow. The windows shook, the candles bled wax like tears, and the ground swelled as if something underneath was pressing upward. The dogs howled until their throats broke, and in the lightning's flash, they saw them, the pale infants, dozens of them, crawling through the flooded fields toward the house, their faces empty of sound, their eyes reflecting the storm. When the light faded, the hollow went still. Only the soft patter of rain remained, and the smell of something newly opened, newly breathing, newly awake. They say the midwife was found kneeling in the water, her hands cupped as if still holding a child, but there was nothing there, only the faint outline of a face forming beneath the surface, a face that looked too much like her own. And as dawn crept over the hollow, the mist thickened again. It curled through the trees, through the empty houses, through the half-dug graves, and from somewhere deep within it came a sound, a lullaby, hummed low, and the soft, wet whisper of 100 tiny breaths answering back. The hollow does not keep its dead, they say. It only lends them, until the next birth calls them home. The milk in the kitchens curdled again that morning, and in one of the cradles, rocking on its own, something pale opened its eyes and smiled. The first morning it happened. The air was too still for dawn. The mist hung low over the fields, thick enough to swallow sound. And in that silence, a silence so wide it seemed to hold its breath, someone found the rooster. Neck torn open clean as silk, eyes still wet with the reflection of a sun that hadn't yet risen. They buried it behind the smokehouse. But when dawn came, the sky did not lighten. It only turned grey, sluggish, as though it too had been bled by the third day. When the second rooster was found in the same way, the men stopped asking what did it. They started asking who. No one slept well in those days. The hollow's air carried a strange stillness, a kind of waiting. The women said the light was dying slower. The men said it was the soil, too many unblessed things buried beneath it. But the old ones whispered the truth. The crowing of a rooster keeps the night at bay, and if the roosters died, the night might never leave again. The overseer, Harper, called for the midwife. He said she knew how to quiet bad things, that her hands could calm fevers and hush storms. But the mistress wouldn't have it. "She brings births," she hissed. And something follows every birth she tends. Still, Harper rode out for her before dark, and the horse returned before dawn. Riderless, its reins cut clean through. By the week's end, not a single rooster remained. Only a sound, faint, rhythmic, like something breathing beneath the henhouse. The slaves began marking their doors with ash and eggshells, a charm against whatever had come to replace mourning. But even that failed, because soon the dawn stopped entirely. Days bled together. Lanterns stayed lit until their oil ran dry. The world existed only in grey half-light, and the people began to forget what colour the sun was. Children cried without knowing why. Women swore their shadows moved even when they stood still. And somewhere behind the stables a faint scratching began, slow, patient, measured like a heartbeat. Then one night, the mistress woke to a sound, a soft crow. Low and wet it came from beneath her floorboards. She froze, listening. Once, twice, then silence when she leaned closer. She heard something else, a whisper. Not of words, but of something trying to form them. Like a mouth learning speech for the first time. By morning, the hens had torn themselves to pieces. Feathers coated the yard like ash, and in their place, the ground looked stirred, as if something had been digging upward from below. The midwife finally came walking through the fog 3 nights later, her dress wet, her eyes unfocused. In her hands, she carried a broken lantern that still glowed from within. Not from fire, from something pale, moving. The mistress met her at the porch and demanded, "What's happened to my roosters?" The woman smiled, slow and hollow. "They've gone where the sun went," she said. Her voice was calm, heavy with sleep. "They were the last to keep the gate closed." The mistress stepped back. "Gate? What gate?" The midwife didn't answer. She only knelt and pressed her palm to the dirt. The earth pulsed beneath it, once, twice, and from the distance a faint crow echoed, too low, too deep to be a bird. That night, no one dared speak. The air felt swollen, thick with something unseen, and when the clock struck 3, every door on the property creaked open. All at once, from the coops, from the barn, from the root cellar, a smell rose, metallic, sweet, rotting. And something else, the sound of wings dragging across wood. Slow, uneven, deliberate by lantern light, Harper crept toward the noise, and what he found there sent him screaming into the fog. The hens' bodies had split open like cracked fruit. Inside them were tiny, pale figures, neither bird nor man, each with a beak that wasn't bone but skin stretched thin, each staring up with eyes too human to belong in feathers. They twitched toward the dawn that wasn't there, and when Harper raised his torch they hissed, a wet, whispering sound that seemed to carry words not meant for hearing. He dropped the flame, and when the barn burned, the smoke rose straight and black into a sky that did not change. By morning the fields were covered in ash and silence, and for the first time in days the faint light of sun returned. But it was wrong, weak, tinted red as if passing through flesh, and in that light they saw them. Dozens of pale shapes perched along the roofline, still as carvings, their heads tilted in unison. waiting. When the mistress dared to look closer, she saw one move and realized what they truly were. Each one wearing a rooster's face like a mask. Each one breathing in rhythm with the earth beneath them. The midwife stood by the well, hands clasped, her mouth moving though no sound escaped, and behind her the fog began to throb. Like something vast and unborn was struggling to push through. Then came the sound again, a single, broken crow, low and wet, echoing through the hollow, and the light of dawn dimmed once more. Like the sun itself had turned its face away in shame. They say you can still hear it in the mornings. A single rooster trying to crow through water, and if you listen too long, the next dawn forgets to come. It began with the dream, a dream so vivid it left marks on her skin, faint indentations like fingers pressed from the inside. She woke gasping, the taste of iron on her tongue. Her nightdress damp, her belly trembling as though it had heard something she hadn't. For 7 nights she told herself it was imagination, that her body still carried echoes of childbirth, that her mind, and exhausted, hysterical, conjured movements that weren't there. But when she pressed her palm flat against her stomach, something pressed back. The sound of wind through the magnolia trees had always soothed her, but now it whispered differently, slower, heavier, like the breath of something learning to mimic life. Each morning the house grew quieter, as though it too listened, and each night the air thickened with a sweetness that was not perfume but decay. The servants began avoiding her door. They said her room hummed after dark, that the walls throbbed faintly, in rhythm with her breath, and that when she slept, she spoke to someone who was not there, softly, tenderly, like a mother whispering lullabies to a child she could not see. By the 3rd night, she had convinced herself to call the midwife back. But when the girl sent to fetch her returned, she was trembling and empty-handed. "The midwife won't come, ma'am," she whispered. "Said she already delivered what was hers to deliver." The mistress struck her across the face, not in anger, but in terror, because somewhere deep in her belly, something laughed. The mirror in her room began to cloud, not with dust but with breath, faint at first, then visible each time she approached it. The glass shimmered, and she could swear she saw a second reflection behind her own, a smaller shape, pressed close as if trapped inside. Its hands, if they were hands, rested against the glass, mirroring hers perfectly. The house began to rot from the inside out. The milk soured within hours, candles bled wax that smelled like spoiled honey, and the cat, once her companion, would not cross her doorway again. It hissed at her shadow and fled into the cornfields where the crows gathered silently at dusk. She prayed more fervently with each passing day. Her rosary clutched until her knuckles turned white. Yet the more she prayed, the stiller the thing inside her became. It was as though her devotion lulled it into watching her instead. When she opened her eyes after the final amen, she found the crucifix above her bed turned upside down, not fallen but twisted, as if by deliberate hands. On the 6th night her husband, as pale, drunk, and silent, refused to sleep beside her. He muttered that she had changed, that her eyes had grown darker, that her voice carried echoes when she spoke at supper. He watched her hand rest protectively over her stomach and flinched. "I buried that child," he said, trembling, but she only smiled and said, "Not all things that are buried stay gone." He fled before dawn, and by morning the bed smelled of soil and milk. The sheets were damp with something that wasn't sweat. And her mirror, that cursed breathing mirror, had begun to pulse like flesh. She could hear it softly beating when she passed. Like a second heart searching for rhythm, when she could bear no more, she tore the cloth from it and screamed. For what stared back was no longer her. It was her and something else. Fused at the edges, her reflection's mouth moved slower than her own. Its belly was distended, writhing with faint movement beneath translucent skin, and its eyes were calm and maternal as if it pitied her. "Give it back," she whispered to her reflection. But the glass only swelled outward, a ripple that became a bulge. Then the faint outline of a face, small, wet, impossibly close. It opened its mouth and pressed it to the glass, a soft kiss, and then she felt it move inside her again, stronger than before. So strong it bent her spine and filled her lungs with air that wasn't hers. By the 7th night, the house had gone completely silent. Even the crickets dared not sing, only the faint, steady sound of breathing came from her room. Though she was alone, The servants who dared peek through the keyhole saw her standing before the mirror, her nightdress torn open, her hands on her belly, the glass breathing in and out with her, perfectly synchronized, each breath fogging the surface, and each exhale forming words, not born, returned. The girl who watched ran until her voice broke, and when she brought others to see, the room was empty, the bed immaculate, the air cold and damp as a crypt. Only the mirror remained uncovered, its glass slick with moisture, and on its surface, the faint print of 2 hands pressed from the inside, one large. One small. That night the house began to hum again, but this time the sound came from beneath the floorboards, slow, rhythmic, like the heartbeat of something new learning to live. And when dawn came, the first light touched the mirror, and the reflection smiled back. But the room stood empty. The mistress was gone. Only her rosary hung from the frame, and inside the glass, the faint outline of her swollen silhouette shimmered once, before the surface stilled, breathing no more. And in the nursery down the hall, a cradle began to rock on its own, as the mirror exhaled a final time, fogging into the shape of a newborn's breath. The first time they saw the light, it was drifting through the fog like a heartbeat, soft, pulsing, patient, as if it had nowhere else to be but among the graves of the forgotten. It began after the mistress vanished, when the house fell silent, and the air around Cypress Hollow turned thick with rot. No one dared go near the burial field behind the magnolias, not after the milk spoiled again, and the well water turned red at dawn. But still that light moved, slow and steady. From one small mound to the next, it was always seen at the same hour, just before the cock should crow. When night hung heavy, but the sky hinted at grey, a time between worlds, the elders whispered. When the living and the buried listened for each other, they said it was her, the midwife, moving between the graves she made, humming those same lullabies she used to murmur between screams, the same soft tune that kept the mothers calm, while the life drained from their newborns. They said she carried her lantern low, so the wind wouldn't disturb the flame. But those who saw it up close said there was no fire inside, only something that moved, like a small heart floating in glass, pulsing to the rhythm of her song. The first man who tried to follow her never came back whole. His horse returned without him. Eyes rolled white, reins slick with blood. They found him 3 days later near the cypress pond, mouth full of dirt, nails torn, his face twisted upward toward the trees, like he'd seen the sky collapse. Hand in his hand at a broken wick, still warm, but still the lantern came, and each night it stopped longer at certain graves, as if counting or waiting for an answer. Some said the midwife had made a promise long ago, that she'd deliver souls as easily as she delivered children, and the thing she'd struck her bargain with was collecting payment. Others swore she was guarding them, the small white infants who'd been buried too young to cry, keeping their restless spirits from wandering into the world, keeping the living safe from their return. But no one dared test the theory. One night, an old field hand named Josiah said he'd seen her clearer than most. He spoke of it only once, and even then, his words trembled like something inside him was still listening. He said she was kneeling, one hand buried deep in the soil, the other clutching the lantern close to her chest, as if warming it with her heart. And when he crept close enough to hear her, her humming stopped, her head turned slow, and the light swelled and brighter, redder, until he realized it wasn't the lantern glowing. It was her eyes. "Midwife," he whispered. "What are you doing out here?" Her voice came soft as if from under the ground. "Counting, child. They don't all stay buried, not unless I remind them." She smiled when she said it, not kindly, but with weariness, as if she'd been keeping a secret for too long. Then she pressed her palm deeper into the earth, and the ground pulsed beneath her hand like flesh. He ran, but the sound followed him, a low hum that rose into a shriek, not from her mouth, but from the soil itself, as if hundreds of tiny lungs were gasping beneath it. When he looked back, the light was no longer in her hand. It had sunk into the dirt, and the graves around her began to glow, each mound breathing faintly. By morning the field was still, but every grave had shifted, as though the earth had turned in its sleep. The overseer ordered the place fenced off, said no one should tread there again. But the slaves whispered that the fence was useless. You can't keep spirits penned when their keeper walks free. And yet she did not stay free for long, because the next night the lantern moved on its own, no hand to hold it, just drifting through the fog, tracing the same slow path as before. When it paused before the last grave, the ground split open, a small wet sound, like lips parting after a long silence, and something answered her hum, something soft, faint, like the cooing of a newborn by the seventh night. The lantern stopped moving altogether. It burned in one place and above the oldest grave, the one no one remembered digging, and when the dawn came, the flame inside had turned black, smoke curling downward instead of up, as if the light itself was being swallowed that morning. The mistress's portrait fell from the parlor wall, glass cracked clean through the eyes, and the house filled with a smell of milk and blood. The servants swore they heard a lullaby drifting through the floorboards, the same tune the midwife used to hum, only slower now, deeper, as if sung by more than one voice. The lantern still burns there. They say it's glass dark, its flame faint, and if you walk past Cypress Hollow at night, you'll see her kneeling still, half shadow, half light, hands buried in the soil, eyes burning brighter than fire, as the earth beneath her rises and falls, like the breathing of sleeping children. And sometimes, if the mist is thin and the night too quiet, you'll hear the soil whisper back, soft and wet and full of hunger, "Mama." That's when the light goes out, and the graves begin to open. If you want to hear more of this, subscribe to the channel. They said the earth had grown tired of her offerings, that even the worms would not touch what she laid beneath the moon, and by dawn, the soil always told the same story. Something small had struggled upward, pressing through with tiny, impossible hands. The graveyard behind the old birthing shack was not marked on any map, though everyone in the valley knew where it was. You could find it by sound, the slow rhythmic hum that rose after midnight, like a woman crooning to a child she could not see. Some said it was the wind passing through the dry reeds by the river. Others said it was her. She had been a midwife before the war, before the plantation burned, before the cries of infants turned to whispers of sin and secrecy. Her name had long been erased from paper, yet her deeds were stitched into the nightmares of those who came after. They called her the keeper of the quiet ones. It began with one child, and pale, stillborn, lips the color of wax. She had buried it herself when the mother refused to look. She said a prayer she half remembered from her grandmother's songs, pressing the soil with her bare palms until the ground felt calm again. But when she returned the next morning, the grave had been disturbed. The dirt cracked open like a wound that refused to heal. She thought it was animals at first, but there were no tracks, no claw marks, no signs of hunger. Just the faint shape of something that had pushed upward. The second night she buried it deeper, whispered more, lit a lantern and stayed until dawn. Still, by morning, the earth had moved again. It became a ritual after that. Each week another pale child, another mound of soil, another whisper into the darkness. She began to hum while she worked, low, rhythmic, almost motherly, and those who passed near the fields would hear it through the mist. "Rest easy, little one. The night don't mean you harm." They said her voice was strange, not broken, not sorrowful, but loving, as if she were speaking not to the dead, but to something waiting to be born again. Then came the rains. The earth softened, and the graves began to swell. One morning, the overseer's wife found small prints in the mud behind her porch. Not animal, not grown, child-sized. They trailed toward the edge of the forest, then vanished into the fog. The midwife was questioned. Her hands were shaking, her clothes damp with soil. When they asked what she'd seen, she said only this: "It's not me they follow. It's the song." That night, the lantern light returned to the graveyard. The storm had not yet passed, but there it was, moving slow between the infant mounds. Some swore they saw her kneeling again, humming as she pressed her palms into the ground. Others said they saw small shapes around her, swaying like reeds in the wind. And when she turned, her eyes burned brighter than the flame. The sheriff came 3 days later. He found the graves empty, all 23. Only the lantern remained, still lit, though the oil inside had long run dry. He said the ground was warm, that it pulsed beneath his boots like a living thing. After that, no one dared to bury their dead near the fields, but the hum persisted, faint, steady, as if the land itself remembered her lullaby. Some nights travelers on the road claimed to see a flicker in the distance, a light moving among the cedars, and beneath it, the outline of a woman bent low, her lips whispering to the dirt. One farmer swore he heard a child laughing from beneath his porch. Another found tiny handprints pressed into the frost on his window, and by morning, as always, one grave stood open again. The soil lifted from within, not by hunger, not by grief, but by memory. Those who listened too long to the sound from the ground said it began to change. It no longer wept or called him, it answered. "Mama, they say the midwife still roams those fields when the moon is thin and the fog is deep, carrying her lantern low, searching for the one child who will not rest, who crawls from the earth again and again, calling her by name she no longer remembers. And when she finally finds it, they say the light goes out and the ground goes quiet, until morning, when the grave opens once more and the sound begins again. They said the blaze began before dawn, not with a crack or an explosion but a sigh, as if something beneath the cabin had exhaled after holding its breath for too long, and when the fire rose, it did not devour, it searched. The birthing cabin had stood for nearly 40 years at the edge of the cane fields, a crooked thing with walls that leaned like a body, tired from kneeling. Even in ruin, it carried a strange dignity, the kind that comes from secrets too heavy to burn away. The locals avoided it for decades, whispering that its wood still remembered the sound of screams and lullabies. Sometimes both at once. On the night it burned, the sky was black with storm clouds that never opened. No lightning, no thunder, just wind, thick and restless, circling like a predator that had found its scent. Inside, the old midwife sat at her table with a single candle, its flame trembling as though afraid to speak. She'd buried too many children to count, each with a name whispered only once. And though her hands were older now, her bones weaker, her heart had not forgotten. It beat not with life, but with remembrance. The wind pushed through the cracks, carrying voices. At first faint, like children calling from across a river, then louder, clearer, closer. "Mama, you forgot one." Her eyes snapped open. The flame stretched toward the sound, bending unnaturally, pointing like a finger. She rose slowly, every joint creaking, and whispered, "You shouldn't be awake, not tonight." But the voices did not fade. They multiplied, overlapping in tones both tender and furious. Then came the heat. It did not bloom from the candle. It entered through the walls, through the very wood, as if something had crawled up from the soil beneath. The first lick of fire was gentle. It slid along the beams like a curious hand. The next was bolder, tracing the windows, the floorboards, her shadow. Within seconds, the entire room glowed like a lantern made of grief. Still, she did not move, because she saw faces in the fire, small faces, familiar, each one blinking in and out of the flame like a breath half taken. She could name them: Ruth, Samuel, Clara, the twins. All those she had laid in the earth and prayed would not rise again. They were not burning. They were alive within it. The fire began to speak in rhythm, a pulse of crackling that matched her heartbeat. The wind outside slowed, as if listening. "Midwife," the voice said, low and layered, the sound of many throats speaking as one. "Your debt is not yet due." She fell to her knees, clutching her chest, not from pain but from understanding. For years she had believed the graves demanded silence, that the hum she gave them was enough to keep them sleeping. But this was no haunting. It was harvest. The fire surged, reaching toward her hair, her hands, her lips. It did not consume, it tasted. Her flesh shimmered but did not blacken. Her skin glowed like embered wood, her eyes like coals catching wind. Outside, the neighbors saw the glow rise above the trees. They said it looked like daylight, though no sun had risen. They gathered at the fence line but dared not cross. For the smoke did not rise. It descended, curling low to the ground, moving on its own accord. By morning the cabin was ash, but not a single board had fallen outward. The ruins sat perfect, symmetrical, as though arranged by careful hands. In the center, where the table once stood, lay only footprints, dozens of them, each the size of a newborn's. And from those prints, faint trails of soot led out toward the fields, vanishing into the fog. The sheriff returned with a team of men to dig through the remains. They found no bones, no body, not even the iron pots she'd used for boiling water. Only the lantern from the graveyard, buried beneath a mound of grey dust. Inside it, the flame still burned. When he tried to smother it, the wick hissed and something inside whispered, "You can't put out what remembers its name." That night, the fire spread, not through wood but through stories. The farmers who touched the soil near the ruins said it was warm. The women who passed the field said the air shimmered like heat, though the night was cold. And in the silence between crickets, one could hear breathing, and soft, rhythmic, like an infant dreaming. Weeks later, a young girl was found wandering the edge of the marsh, her dress stained with soot, her eyes dark as smoke. When asked her name, she didn't answer. She only pointed toward the horizon, where the old cabin had stood, and whispered, "She's still in there." No one returned after that. The land was left to itself, the grass growing over the blackened foundation until the shape of the cabin disappeared. But every few years, when the harvest moon hung low and red, the light returned, and low and moving, as if carried by unseen hands. Those who saw it said the fire no longer burned outward, but spoke, its glow pulsing like breath, its whisper traveling through the reeds like a secret too heavy to stay buried. And if you stood too close, if you listened long enough, you could hear what it was saying. Not words, not language, just one sound, and steady, rising, endless, like a woman humming to the ashes that learned how to breathe. The night clung to the earth like a mother that would not let go, and the stars, those pale eyes of heaven, watched in silence, afraid to blink, for they knew what crawled beneath the soil of Cypress Hollow that night, and whose hands would rise to finish what the light dared not see. The midwife had not been seen for weeks. Some said she had wandered into the bayou and sunk without sound. Others whispered she had burned with her cabin, her ashes scattered like black snow across the fields. But the truth was quieter, older, still breathing. She had gone underground, beneath the hollow, where the roots tangled with the bones of infants too pale to rest. There was a tunnel that led nowhere wholly. The earth was warm there, always shifting, as if the soil itself had a pulse. She carried her lantern still, its flame whispering her name in every flicker. The pact had not ended with fire. It had only deepened. She moved slowly, barefoot, her hem trailing through damp clay. Around her, small shapes stirred, shadows in the dirt that breathed when she did. They followed her like obedient children, unseen but felt, their laughter too thin to belong to the living. She had made a promise to them long ago, that no cradle would stay full when the moon turned black, that no mother would keep what was not meant for this world. Each birth had been an offering, each death a keeping of balance. But the fire had changed the order, had loosened what was meant to sleep. Now the world above trembled without knowing why. The roosters no longer crowed. The milk soured before it reached the table. The sun itself seemed hesitant, rising slower each morning, as though fearful of what it might illuminate. The people whispered prayers with their mouths closed tight, afraid their breath might summon what lingered in the soil, and beneath it all, she worked. "Not yet," she murmured to the flame, her voice cracked like old wood. "Not until the last cradle is empty." The flame flinched at her words, shrinking as though it understood. Then it steadied again, obedient, trembling, alive. Above her the ground shifted. The wind outside began to moan through the trees, and a faint rhythm echoed through the hollow. Not footsteps, rocking. The slow, creaking sway of an empty cradle being moved by unseen hands. She stopped, lifted her head, and whispered a prayer that was not meant for God. "If I stop now," she said, "they'll wake hungry." The lantern dimmed, and for a moment she saw them all, the infants she had buried, the mothers she had failed, the pale-eyed things that had returned to call her mother in their sleep. They lined the tunnel walls soft as fog, unmoving, waiting. Their silence was heavier than a scream. When she reached the end of the passage, there was a door. It was not built by hands. It had grown, the wood merging with the root of an ancient cypress, its grain spiraling inward like a fingerprint of the earth itself. She pressed her palm against it, and it shuddered under her touch. "I'm here," she whispered. "You can rest now." The door opened, but what waited beyond was not rest. It was a nursery. The cradles were carved from black oak, lined with linen that had never been washed. Every one of them rocked gently, though no wind stirred. Some were empty. Some were not. The air was thick with milk and blood and something older, something sweet. Like decay turned tender. As she stepped inside, the lantern brightened, throwing its trembling glow across the walls. There were drawings there, childlike scrawls made in soot and ash. Circles with eyes, small hands, flames. Beneath one, written in her own handwriting, were the words, "Before the dawn remembers, they must forget." Her knees gave way. The lantern swayed. She began to sob, Not with grief, but with awe, the sound low and human, only in rhythm, because now she remembered. She remembered that the fire had not been meant to punish her, but to remind her. That the children she delivered had not died, they had been claimed, and that every dawn delayed, every rooster silenced, was not nature breaking. It was mercy buying time, time for her to finish. One by one, she went to the cradles, lifting what lay inside. The things in her arms were neither living nor dead. Their eyes were wide, their skin faintly luminous, as if lit from within by the same fire that had once spoken her name. "Sleep," she whispered to each, rocking them gently. "Sleep before the sun sees you." They did not close their eyes. They only watched her, their small hands twitching, their mouths moving as though forming words they did not yet know how to say. When she reached the final cradle, she hesitated. It was smaller than the rest. Inside was nothing, only ashes, fine and pale. She touched them with her fingertips, and they stirred. From beneath the ashes came the faintest sound, a breath, and then a whisper. "You forgot me, Mother?" The lantern's flame flared high, spilling light across the nursery. The walls began to pulse like living flesh. The air thickened, humming with the voices of countless cradles that now rocked in perfect rhythm. "No," she gasped, backing away. "You were the first—" But the ashes rose, swirling into the shape of something small, almost human, its eyes twin coals of light. The fire from the lantern leapt toward it, reuniting like blood remembering a wound. The child smiled. Now the dawn remembers. Outside the horizon blazed red, not with sunrise but with recollection. The light came too early, too bright, as if the heavens had opened their eyes before they were ready. The field steamed. The trees glowed from within, and every grave in Cypress Hollow cracked open with a sigh. Beneath it all, the nursery rocked. The cradles creaked in unison, their lullaby swelling until it became indistinguishable from the roar of wind and flame. And when the first ray of sunlight touched the hollow, it hesitated, then trembled, bending backward, as if recoiling from what it saw. For standing in the center of the light, holding her lantern high, was the midwife herself. Her face burned away to something luminous and wrong, her shadow cradling 100 tiny arms, and from her throat came a sound the sun had not heard since the beginning. A lullaby older than mercy, sung to children who had never been born.